I worked as a rideshare driver in a quiet suburban area on the edge of Seattle. My shift was almost over when I got one last request: a pickup from a bar near the city limits. The man who slid into the back seat was wearing a worn-out baseball cap, with eyes hidden beneath the brim. I couldn't see much of his face, but his voice was low and deliberate when he said, "Let's take Route 48. Avoid traffic." Something didn't feel right, but I told myself it was just end-of-the-shift jitters. It was only 11 miles. How bad could it be? We drove in silence, the only sound being the rumble of my old Honda's engine. As the city lights faded behind us, the highway became more isolated, swallowed by trees on either side. My unease grew with every mile. I tried to start a conversation, but he didn't reply. I glanced at the rearview mirror. His face was unreadable in the dim light, but there was something off about the way he sat. Too still, too calm. About 15 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Ryder canceled the trip. My heart sank. I was driving someone who wasn't supposed to be in my car. I felt my skin crawl and my pulse quickened. I stammered, "Hey, looks like the trip got canceled. Should I drop you off here, or?" No response. I sped up, adrenaline kicking in, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. I needed to get to the next exit and drop him. Just get him out of my car fast. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him shift in the back seat. Something metallic glinted in his hand. Panic hit me in waves. I tried to keep my voice calm. You, have to leave? I'll pull over up ahead, okay?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward slightly. That's when I saw it. A long metal wrench wrapped loosely in his hand. My mind raced. He wasn't here for a ride. There was no other car in sight. Just us alone, in the dark, on Route 48. I pressed down on the gas, the engine whining as we sped toward the next off-ramp. My hands were slick with sweat, and I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my neck. I spotted an exit sign, 1 mile ahead. Just 1 mile, I told myself. I can make it. Suddenly, the man shifted again. His other hand grabbed the door handle. I acted on instinct. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes hard. The tires screamed against the asphalt as the car skidded to a halt, jerking violently to one side. He didn't have time to react. The door flew open, and he was thrown halfway out of the car, wrench clattering to the ground. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I hit the gas and sped away, heart pounding in my ears, headlights slicing through the darkness. In my rearview mirror, I saw him stagger to his feet, standing motionless in the road as I disappeared into the night. When I finally reached a gas station, I locked the doors, parked under the bright fluorescent lights, and called the police. I gave them every detail I could remember, but by the time they arrived and searched the area, he was gone. The next morning, I learned from the news that a body had been found near Route 48. The police had been searching for a man matching the description of my passenger for weeks. They never found him. I moved into a small apartment complex in a quiet neighborhood 2 months ago, looking for a fresh start. It seemed perfect until I noticed the apartment across the hall. The man who lived there never opened his windows, and thick black curtains blocked any view inside. At first, I thought nothing of it. Everyone likes their privacy, right? But over time, his odd behavior started to gnaw at me. He never left during the day, and when he did, it was always in the dead of night. I'd hear his door click shut at 2 or 3 in the morning, heavy footsteps trailing down the hall. I tried to brush it off as none of my business, but there was something about him that left me uneasy. It wasn't just the hours. It was how deliberate he was, like he was trying not to leave a trace behind. Then came the night I woke up to the smell. A thick, pungent odor seeped into my apartment, hanging heavy in the air, acidic and wrong. At first, I thought something had died in the walls, maybe a rat or some other animal. But as I followed the scent, it led to the door across the hall, the one with the black curtains. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, heart thudding in my chest. Something told me not to knock, not to pry. But the smell was so overwhelming, it felt like it was pressing against me, demanding that I do something. I retreated back into my apartment, opened all the windows, and tried to ignore it. But that was when I started hearing noises. Faint thuds from behind the walls, muffled scraping sounds like furniture being dragged or something heavier. I stayed awake most of that night, sitting on the edge of my bed, too wired to sleep. Every sound from the apartment across the hall felt magnified, like it was happening just inches away. I pressed my ear to the wall, and what I heard froze me. It was the faintest sound, a low, deliberate clicking, like someone slowly unlocking a door. The next day, I tried to tell myself I was imagining things. Maybe I was just paranoid, but then I saw him leave. He carried a large, heavy duffel bag slung awkwardly over his shoulder, like it was too cumbersome to manage. He moved quickly, glancing down the hall as he shuffled toward the stairwell. He was barefoot, his steps silent on the tiled floor, and his posture hunched as if he didn't want to be noticed. I held my breath until he disappeared down the stairs, and when he was gone, something inside me snapped. I needed to know what was behind those black curtains. I told myself it was curiosity, nothing more. I didn't plan on doing anything reckless. Just a peek through the keyhole, enough to quiet the gnawing feeling in my gut. But when I leaned down and pressed my eye to the cold brass, I saw nothing. Not a crack of light, not a flicker of movement. Just blackness, as if the apartment beyond was a void. That was when I heard it. The soft shift of something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by the click of the door from the stairwell. He was back. My stomach dropped, and I bolted from my apartment. I barely had time to shut the door quietly before I heard his footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving toward his door. There was a pause, a heartbeat of silence that felt like an eternity, and then the metallic clink of his lock turning. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to control my breathing. Through the thin walls, I could hear him shuffling around inside, moving with purpose. Something was different this time. His movements were sharper, more erratic, as if he knew someone had been near his apartment. The air felt thick with something I couldn't name, an unspoken warning. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening to every noise he made, each creak of the floorboards, each soft drag across the tile. I knew then that whatever was behind those black curtains, I was better off not knowing. 2 nights later, I came home from work to find the door across the hall slightly ajar. The smell was back, stronger, more rancid than before, and this time it was unmistakable. It was decay. I stood frozen, staring at the open door, every instinct telling me to turn around, to walk away, to never look back. But before I could make a decision, I heard movement inside, soft, careful footsteps coming closer. The door creaked open just a little more, and I saw him, a sliver of his pale face, peeking out from the darkness. His eyes locked on mine, and in that moment I knew. He knew I'd been watching. I didn't wait for what came next. I ran, heart pounding in my ears, all the way down the stairs and into the street. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest police station. When the officers arrived, the apartment was empty. The curtains were gone, the furniture cleared out, and the rancid smell had dissipated. There was no trace of the man with the black curtains, no trace that he had ever lived there at all. I booked a remote cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan, hoping to escape the stress of work for a weekend. The listing promised peace, quiet, and miles of untouched wilderness. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was how isolated it really was. No neighbors, no cell service, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the leaves. I told myself this was what I needed, even as the silence began to press in. It felt heavier than I expected, like the landscape was swallowing all sound. The cabin was small but clean, with 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a porch overlooking the forest. It was everything I had hoped for, but there was a strange sense of abandonment, as if someone had left in a hurry. The bed was unmade, and a half-empty bottle of water sat on the counter. I figured the previous guest must have left in a rush, but the detail lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. I unpacked quickly and decided to explore the area before it got too dark. As I wandered deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd. Another cabin, just barely visible through the trees. It wasn't on the listings map. A narrow trail led toward it, but something about the place felt wrong. It stood silent, the windows dark, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. A strange chill crawled up my spine as I stared at it. I don't know why, but I had the sudden urge to turn back. The air around it felt too still, as if the forest itself avoided the place. I forced myself to shake it off. Just an old, abandoned building, probably part of the property's history. That night, I woke to a noise. A steady, deliberate tapping, like someone knocking on wood. For a moment, I thought it was just a branch hitting the cabin, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Someone was out there. I lay frozen in the dark, heart pounding in my ears. The tapping continued, slow and methodical, as if whoever was making the noise knew I was awake, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I told myself it must have been an animal, some nocturnal creature brushing past the walls. But then I heard footsteps, soft, crunching footsteps moving away from the porch, disappearing into the forest. Someone had been watching. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I forced myself to go outside, scanning the tree line for any signs of who might have been there. The forest seemed too quiet, like it was holding its breath. When I checked the dirt path leading away from the porch, I found footprints, bare footprints, deep, deliberate, as if someone had stood there for a long time. They led off in the direction of the second cabin I'd spotted the day before. I didn't want to follow them, but something inside me, curiosity, stupidity, pushed me toward the overgrown trail. I had to know. I had to see for myself that it was just an empty old cabin, nothing more. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to become, like the forest was pressing in on me. When I reached the clearing, the cabin looked even worse up close. The wood warped from years of neglect, the windows caked in grime. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, rotten wood, damp earth, and something else. Something foul. I stepped inside, holding my breath, and scanned the dim interior. There was no furniture, just bare walls and a floor coated in dust. But in the corner, something glinted, a small metal object. I stepped closer, my pulse thudding in my throat. It was a rusted padlock, broken open and tossed on the floor. And next to it, half buried in the dirt, was a shoe, a child's shoe. That's when I heard it again, the same rhythmic tapping coming from the porch. Someone was out there. My stomach twisted and every muscle in my body locked up. Slowly, I turned toward the door, just in time to see a shadow move across the window. Whoever had been tapping was now standing just outside, waiting. I didn't think, I just ran. Bursting through the door, I sprinted back toward my cabin, my breath ragged and my legs burning. I didn't dare look back. The trees blurred around me as I tore through the underbrush, branches clawing at my skin. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the footsteps to follow. But there was only silence. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a kitchen knife, every nerve on edge. Morning came slowly, dragging light across the forest like a reluctant apology. I packed my things in a daze and threw them into the car, desperate to leave. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was gone. When I got back to town, I tried to report what had happened. But when I described the second cabin, the owner looked at me strangely. He said there was only one cabin on the property, the one I'd stayed in. I had signed up for extra hours monitoring the security cameras just to make some extra cash. Most nights, it was easy, just watching people shuffle out at closing time and the janitors doing their rounds. It was well past midnight, and the building had fallen silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. I sat in the dimly lit control room, sipping a cold coffee, scrolling through the feeds. Nothing out of the ordinary. Hallways bathed in pale fluorescent light, empty offices, silent lobbies. But then I saw him, a man standing at the bottom of the emergency stairwell, just beyond the range of the camera. I could only see his legs, bare feet, dirty jeans rolled up at the hem. He was facing the wall, unmoving. At first, I thought it might have been a worker, maybe one of the maintenance guys. But something about the way he stood, so completely still, unsettled me. I switched to the next camera feed, hoping for a better view. Nothing. Just the same pale stairwell. Empty now, except for the faint outline of water stains on the walls. I try to tell myself it was a glitch, an old recording accidentally playing over the live feed. But a knot began forming in my stomach. Minutes ticked by, and I tried to distract myself by scrolling through other feeds. The man's legs haunted the back of my mind. I kept flipping back to that stairwell, but every time, it was empty. Just a quiet stretch of cement steps leading nowhere. Then the motion sensor blinked. I leaned closer to the screen. The same stairwell camera, now showing the upper floors. Something was moving. I watched, heart pounding, as a shadow appeared at the top of the staircase. He was back. This time, I saw his full figure. A thin, hunched man, his clothes hanging loose as if they didn't belong to him. His skin looked pale, almost bluish under the fluorescent light, and his head tilted slightly to one side, like a curious dog listening for a sound. He stood at the top of the stairs, facing the wall again, completely still. I stared at the screen, frozen in place, every nerve in my body on high alert. He wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody had entered the stairwell. There were no alarms, no badges scanned. My hand hovered over the radio, ready to call the night janitor, but something stopped me. I wanted to see what he would do next. For 10 minutes, he didn't move. Just stood there, head tilted, fingers twitching slightly at his sides. I could feel sweat prickling the back of my neck, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. Something about him, the stillness, the deliberate way he avoided the camera's gaze, felt deeply wrong. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and began descending the stairs. I watched in stunned silence as he moved slowly, step by step, always keeping his face out of view. There was something deliberate about the way he moved, like he was trying not to be noticed. He wasn't in a rush. He knew exactly where he was going. I clicked to the next feed, the lobby camera. My breath caught in my throat. There he was again, this time standing just inside the stairwell door. His back was still to the camera, his posture rigid and strange. He wasn't supposed to be there. The building was locked for the night, the alarm set. No one should have been able to get inside. I felt my pulse quicken as the man began to move again, this time heading toward the elevators. Slow, deliberate steps like a predator stalking prey. He disappeared from the frame for a moment, and I frantically switched to the next camera. He was now in the main hallway, moving toward my floor. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my radio, fingers trembling. The janitor's voice crackled on the other end, groggy and annoyed. I told him to stay put, that someone was inside the building. But before he could respond, the radio went silent. And then I heard it, the distant sound of footsteps echoing in the stairwell behind me. I froze, barely breathing. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one echoing louder than the last, getting closer. My skin prickled with cold sweat, every instinct telling me to run, to hide, to get out of that room. But I couldn't move. Then, the door to the stairwell clicked open. A shadow fell across the control room floor. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. I could feel him standing there, just inside the doorway, watching me. I could feel his breath, shallow and ragged, brushing against the back of my neck. I stared at the screens, paralyzed, as the cameras flickered and went dark, one by one. The last thing I saw on the monitor was the control room door slowly swinging shut behind him. I bolted for the door, throwing it open so hard it slammed against the wall. The stairwell was empty. Not a single sound, not a shadow in sight. I ran through the building, heart hammering, checking every room, every corner. He was gone. The police arrived within minutes, but there was no trace of anyone in the building. No signs of forced entry, no suspicious footage on the recorded feeds. The only thing they found was a small puddle of water near the bottom of the stairwell, a perfect imprint of 2 bare feet. I always thought camping alone would be peaceful, a way to clear my head after a long week. The state park was almost deserted, and the quiet seemed like exactly what I needed. The first night, everything felt perfect. I set up my tent near the lake, the water glimmering under the fading light, and made a small fire to warm up dinner. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. It felt like the world had finally stopped spinning for a while. But later, as the fire began to die down, I noticed something strange. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the woods to the edge of my campsite. They weren't mine, and they weren't from earlier that day. Someone had been here while I was inside the tent. The prints circled the fire pit, close but not too close, and then disappeared back into the trees. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it could have been a hiker passing through. But it gnawed at me. Why would anyone come so close without saying a word? I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. Every creak of a branch, every shuffle of leaves felt too deliberate. I told myself I was imagining things, but I kept the flashlight in my hand just in case. Sometime in the early hours, I woke to a noise, footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching over the gravel path near my tent. I held my breath. Whoever it was, they were careful, moving with purpose. I peeked out through the small mesh window, and that's when I saw him, a man standing at the edge of my campsite, just outside the glow of the dying embers. He stood perfectly still, his back to me, as if waiting for something. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't move, didn't dare make a sound. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, he turned, but not toward the forest, toward my tent. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see his head tilt slightly, as if he was listening for me. My chest tightened. I knew I couldn't stay there, waiting to see what he would do next. Slowly, I reached for the zipper of the tent, trying to be as quiet as possible. My heart thudded in my ears, louder with every movement. The zipper gave a soft rasp, and I froze. His head snapped toward the sound. For a long moment, we were locked in a silent standoff, him standing just feet from my tent, and me crouched inside, afraid to breathe. Then, without warning, he stepped closer. I bolted, unzipped the tent in one frantic motion, and stumbled out, flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted toward my car parked down the trail. I didn't look back. I could hear him moving behind me, feet slamming against the ground, gaining on me. My legs burned as I tore through the forest, branches slashing in my arms and face. The only thought in my head was to get to the car. Nothing else mattered. When I reached the trailhead, I fumbled with my keys, heart racing. I heard footsteps closing in. I threw open the door, leapt inside, and slammed it shut just as a shadow passed behind me. I locked the doors and started the engine, my hands trembling. The headlights flicked on, illuminating nothing but empty forest. No man, no movement, just the silent woods stretching endlessly into the night. When the ranger station opened the next morning, I reported everything. They found my campsite exactly as I described, but no footprints, no signs of anyone else. The ranger looked at me like I was crazy and told me the forest had been empty for days. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone that night. Whoever he was, he knew exactly where I was. And next time, I might not make it back. I work as a paramedic in a small rural town, where emergency calls often mean being out in the middle of nowhere. One winter night, my partner and I were dispatched to a remote farmhouse. The report said a man in his 60s had collapsed. It was a routine call, or at least it should have been. We arrived just after midnight, with snow falling in heavy sheets that muffled every sound. The house stood at the end of a long, unpaved road, its windows glowing faintly in the darkness. The scene felt wrong immediately. There were no cars in the driveway, no footprints in the snow, nothing to suggest anyone had come or gone. We radioed in, confirming we were at the address, and headed up the porch steps. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. I glanced at my partner, and we exchanged a silent look. This wasn't normal. We stepped inside, calling out for anyone, but the house was silent. The only sound was the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. We checked the living room and found no one, just a sagging couch, a cold fireplace, and an old TV buzzing softly with static. The kitchen was empty too, but there was something odd. 2 plates of untouched food sitting neatly on the table, forks resting beside them, as if someone had been about to eat but never got the chance. We continued searching, our boots thudding on the hardwood floors, echoing too loudly in the stillness. The longer we were inside, the more the weight of the place pressed down on me. It felt like we weren't supposed to be there, like the house had been waiting for us, and not in a good way. We found the staircase and made our way upstairs. The hallway stretched long and narrow, with several doors on either side. Most were closed, but at the far end, one door was slightly open. A thin strip of dim yellow light spilled out into the hall. I led the way, pushing the door open with my shoulder. Inside was a small, dimly lit bedroom. A man lay motionless on the bed, his face pale and sunken. He looked like he'd been dead for hours, maybe days. But something didn't add up. His body was perfectly arranged, his hands folded neatly over his chest, as if someone had placed him there on purpose. We checked for a pulse out of habit. Nothing. His skin was cold and stiff. My stomach tightened. This wasn't a medical emergency. It was something else entirely. That's when we heard it. The creak of a floorboard behind us. We spun around, but the hallway was empty. Or so it seemed. I felt the air shift, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My partner whispered under his breath that we needed to leave now. We both knew something was deeply wrong. As we started backing out of the room, the lights in the house flickered, then went out completely. For a moment, we stood in absolute darkness, the only sound our shallow breathing. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, moving down the hallway toward us. I fumbled for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark. There was nothing there, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. Hannah gripped me, and I grabbed my partner by the arm. We bolted down the stairs, slipping on the icy floor, hearts pounding in our ears. The footsteps followed us all the way down, relentless and steady, as if whoever or whatever was right behind us. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath in the freezing night air. The house loomed behind us, silent once more. The front door stood wide open, swinging gently in the wind. We radioed for backup and waited in the ambulance, watching the house from a distance. No one ever came out. The police arrived 30 minutes later. They searched every room, every inch of the property, but found nothing. No sign of the man we saw on the bed, no footprints in the snow, and no trace of anyone else inside. The dispatcher later told us something strange. The house had been abandoned for years. There was no recent record of anyone living there, and no reason for a call to be placed. The original report? It had never been logged. It was late, past 2 a.m., and the streets had emptied out. My phone buzzed with a notification. My driver was close, and his car, a silver sedan, was just 2 minutes away. I waited on the corner under the dim street light, the cold air gnawing at my skin. A silver sedan pulled up, just like the app said it would. It looked exactly right, same make, same color. Without hesitation, I slid into the back seat and shut the door behind me, feeling the cold leather under me. The driver didn't say anything at first. He was hunched slightly over the wheel, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled low over his head. I caught a glimpse of his face in the rearview mirror, just enough to notice how pale he looked under the greenish glow of the dashboard. Something about him unsettled me, but I brushed it off. It was late. He was probably just tired. I buckled my seatbelt as the car merged onto the main road. The ride felt strange from the start. The driver never confirmed my name, and I hadn't thought to double-check the license plate. I stared down at my phone, watching the map on the rideshare app. But the blue dot, my ride, was moving away from my address. Maybe he's taking a shortcut, I thought. But the longer we drove, the more wrong it felt. We were heading farther from the familiar streets, deeper into parts of town I didn't recognize. I opened my mouth to say something. Maybe he missed a turn, but the words caught in my throat. He drove with an unsettling focus, hands gripping the wheel too tightly, as if he was on a mission. The car slowed down, taking a sharp turn onto a narrow, unlit road. The streetlights disappeared behind us, swallowed by the dark. I glanced out the window, my pulse quickening. We were nowhere near my neighborhood. I forced myself to ask, how much longer until we get there? But the question never came out. He never gave me a chance to speak. Without warning, he hit the locks. The mechanical clunk echoed through the silent car, and my stomach dropped. I tried to act calm, not wanting to panic just yet. My fingers hovered over the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The car kept moving, the engine humming steadily, the tires crunching over gravel. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. I tried to cancel the ride, but the app said I was already dropped off. That's when I knew this wasn't my driver. My breath hitched, heart hammering in my chest. I glanced up at the rearview mirror. The driver's eyes were locked on me, dark and unblinking, watching my every move. He knew I had figured it out. We hit a stretch of road surrounded by dense forest on both sides. No lights, no houses, just endless darkness. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, trying to dial 911. He saw me. The car jerked violently to the side, tires screeching as he veered off the road and slammed to a stop. The seatbelt cut into my shoulder as I was thrown forward. Before I could react, he lunged over the center console, grabbing my arm with a grip like iron. I twisted away, kicking the door with all my strength. It didn't open. His hands clawed at me, desperate to keep me inside. Somehow, in my panic, I reached the window controls and jammed my thumb down. The glass slid open just enough. I squeezed through, scraping my knees against the jagged edges, and hit the ground hard. I ran, adrenaline surging through me, my legs burning, branches snapping under my feet. The sound of his car door slamming shut echoed behind me. I could hear him, his heavy footsteps pounding against the gravel, closing in fast. I didn't stop running until I saw headlights, a truck coming down the road. I burst from the trees, waving my arms wildly. The driver braked just in time, and I scrambled inside, gasping for breath, trying to explain what had just happened. When the police arrived, the silver sedan was gone. They searched the area, but found nothing. The license plate I gave them didn't match any car on the rideshare system. The real driver showed up on my phone later that night, confused about where I had gone. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. That man, whoever he was, wasn't just giving rides. I manage a small Airbnb rental on the outskirts of town, a quiet, out-of-the-way place. Most guests stay for a night or two, just passing through. This one was different. He booked the place for a week, but something felt off from the moment he checked in. When I met him at the door, he barely made eye contact. Tall, thin, with a distant look in his eyes, like he was somewhere else entirely. He carried a single duffel bag, slung low over his shoulder, and gave me a polite nod before disappearing inside. I thought little of it at the time. People are strange sometimes. The first couple of days went by quietly. No complaints, no noise. I didn't even see him leave the house. But on the third day, something shifted. I drove by the property to drop off fresh towels. But when I reached the door, it was already unlocked. I hesitated for a moment, hand hovering above the handle. I called out, just in case, but no answer came. The silence inside felt wrong, too still, too empty. I stepped inside, and the air felt stale, as if the windows hadn't been opened in days. The living room was untouched, exactly as I had left it. The only sign of life was his duffel bag, sitting by the couch, unzipped and partially open. Inside, I could see clothing folded neatly, but no toiletries, no personal items. Something about it struck me as odd. A man staying a week with nothing but clothes? I told myself I was being paranoid and placed the towels on the bed. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Breathing. I froze in place, ears straining. It was faint, steady, but close. Too close. The sound wasn't coming from the bedroom. It was coming from the small closet near the back of the house. A chill crept down my spine. I told myself it was probably nothing, a draft. Maybe, but my body was screaming at me to leave. Still, something pulled me toward the closet. I reached for the handle, fingers trembling, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just an empty space, lined with old hangers. The air inside smelled faintly of damp fabric and dust. I exhaled, laughing nervously at myself for being so jumpy. Then, just as I turned away, I noticed something strange. The floor was scuffed, as if it had been moved. A small gap between the baseboard and the floor caught my eye. It looked like someone had pushed it slightly off kilter. revealing a crack just wide enough to fit a piece of paper. Or fingers. My heart pounded. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the floor. The faint, steady breathing was louder now, right beneath me. Someone was under the house. I shot to my feet, every nerve screaming at me to run. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking. The duffel bag sat in the corner of the room, staring back at me like it held a secret. And that's when I noticed it. The closet door was now slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. I was certain. The breathing beneath the floor stopped. The silence stretched unbearably thin. And then I heard it. The quiet creak of the closet door slowly opening wider. I didn't wait. I bolted for the door, yanking it open with such force it slammed against the wall. As I stumbled onto the porch, I caught a glimpse of movement from inside, just the barest flicker of a shadow slipping deeper into the house. I slammed the front door shut, locking it from the outside with trembling hands, and ran to my car. My chest burned with each panic breath as I sped away, gravel kicking up behind me. I called the police the moment I reached town. They arrived within the hour, but the house was empty. No guest, no duffel bag, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The officer told me the booking didn't exist. The app had no record of the man, no reservation in my system. It was as if he had never been there at all. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. Someone is still in that house. That night, I was heading home from a weekend at my sister's place, the highway stretching empty before me. It was nearly 1 a.m., and the miles flew by in a blur of headlights and dark asphalt. Everything about the drive felt routine until I noticed the car behind me. At first, it was just another vehicle, its headlights a distant glow in my rearview mirror. But the longer I drove, the closer it got. The car didn't speed past me. It stayed just far enough behind to be noticeable, matching my speed exactly. I changed lanes expecting it to go by, but it followed my every move, sliding into the same lane, keeping a steady distance. I gripped the wheel tighter. It wasn't a cop. That much I knew. And it wasn't someone in a hurry. It felt deliberate, too deliberate. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as paranoia. Maybe the driver was just zoning out and happened to be going the same direction. But when I took an exit onto a smaller, deserted road to shake them off, the car followed. A knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. I drove for another 10 minutes along the quiet, winding road, the other car trailing just far enough back to be out of reach but too close to dismiss. I could feel the weight of their presence, like a shadow creeping just behind me, waiting. The narrow two-lane road was flanked by dense forest, and there was nowhere to pull over without being completely vulnerable. My pulse quickened with each curve, each bend in the road. The thought of stopping, of seeing whoever was behind the wheel, sent chills down my spine. I pressed down harder on the gas, hoping to put some distance between us. For a moment, it worked. The car fell back, the lights dimming in my mirror. I told myself it was over. Maybe they had realized they were on the wrong road. Then I saw them again, the headlights reappearing around the bend, brighter than before, gaining on me. Panic clawed at my chest. I couldn't keep driving aimlessly. I needed to do something. Up ahead, the road split. One lane veering left into a small, deserted rest area, the other continuing deeper into the forest. I made a snap decision and took the left. The tires screeched as I pulled into the empty lot, gravel crunching under my wheels. I killed the headlights and slouched low in my seat, heart pounding in my ears. The road beyond the rest area remained empty for a few seconds. I held my breath, praying the other driver would keep going. Then they appeared. The car slowed as it passed the rest area, just a little too slow, like they were looking for something. Or someone. My fingers dug into the steering wheel as I shrank lower, willing myself invisible. For a moment, it seemed like they were going to keep driving. But then their brake lights flared. The car reversed, creeping back toward the entrance of the rest area. My pulse hammered against my ribs, my hands slick with sweat. I saw the door swing open. A figure stepped out tall, wearing a hood, moving with purpose. They didn't call out, didn't look around. They just stood there, facing my car as if they knew I was inside. I held my breath, frozen, watching as they took a few steps closer. Then they stopped. The seconds stretched unbearably. the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. The figure stood perfectly still, just outside the glow of the streetlight, their face hidden in shadow. Then, without warning, they turned and walked back to their car. I stayed low, heart racing, as I watched them get inside. The car's engine hummed to life, and they pulled out onto the road, disappearing into the dark. But something about the way they left felt unfinished, like they were waiting for the right moment to come back. It took me a full 10 minutes to gather the courage to move. When I finally pulled back onto the road, I kept my headlights off until I was miles away. The police didn't take me seriously when I reported the incident the next day. They said it was probably just someone lost, someone confused. But I know better. That driver wasn't confused. They knew exactly what they were doing. And now, every time I drive that stretch of road, I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next person to follow. When I agreed to house sit for a friend while she was out of town, I didn't expect anything unusual. It was a quiet neighborhood, and all I had to do was water the plants and feed her cat. But something about the basement door made me uneasy from the moment I arrived. It was the only door in the house with a padlock bolted tight. I noticed it the first evening while making sure all the windows were locked. It seemed out of place in an otherwise cozy, lived-in home. At first, I figured my friend must have been storing something valuable down there, tools, old furniture. But the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why would anyone need a padlock on a basement door in their own house? The cat refused to go near it. Every time I walked past the door, the cat would arch its back and scurry to another room. I tried to ignore the strange unease gnawing at me, but it grew with each passing day. By the third night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the door, it was the silence behind it. The house felt normal, except for that one spot. No sounds came from the basement. No hum of an old heater or shuffle of forgotten boxes. Just absolute, unsettling silence. I told myself it was none of my business, but curiosity got the better of me. I kept staring at that padlock, wondering what was behind it. I knew I shouldn't, but it was eating away at me, the thought that there might be something hidden just beneath my feet. Late that night, I found myself standing in front of the door, flashlight in hand. My heart raced as I debated with myself. I knew my friend would be furious if she found out I tried to get in, but she'd never know, right? I pulled at the padlock, testing it. It was old, scratched, as if someone had tried to open it before. To my surprise, it gave way with a bit of force. The lock was loose, poorly fastened. The door creaked open slowly. A wave of cold air washed over me, heavy with the scent of damp concrete, and something else, a faint, metallic tang that made my skin crawl. I aimed my flashlight down the stairs. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating bare concrete walls and an unfinished floor. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw it, a chair placed dead center in the room. There were no boxes, no tools, just the chair sitting alone under a dim, flickering bulb. And ropes. Frayed ropes were tied around the arms and legs of the chair, as if someone had been bound there. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a chill settle deep in my bones, a creeping realization that I'd stumbled onto something I was never meant to see. That's when I noticed the scratch marks, long, jagged streaks carved into the concrete floor, leading away from the chair. They dragged toward the far wall, where an old wooden door stood slightly ajar. I should have turned back. I knew I should have walked away, but something pulled me toward that door, as if I had to know what was beyond it. I pushed it open. A mattress lay in the corner, stained and sagging. Next to it, a small metal bucket. The stench hit me. It was thick, rancid, like something had been left to rot. And then I saw it, a photograph pinned to the wall. It was of me, a candid shot, taken from somewhere inside the house. My face framed perfectly, as if I'd been watched. The flashlight slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor, the beam swinging wildly. In the dim light, I noticed the edges of other photographs tucked behind the mattress, dozens of them. All of me. Panic surged through me. I bolted up the stairs, heart pounding, the walls seeming to close in around me. As I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and twisted the lock back into place with shaking hands. I grabbed the cat and my car keys and ran out the front door, not bothering to turn off the lights or lock up. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town. When I called my friend the next morning, she sounded confused. She said the basement had been locked for years, ever since she bought the house. She claimed she didn't even have the key. I never went back, and every now and then, I still wonder who had been watching me and how long had they been waiting. I was driving across the country, trying to make it to the next town before nightfall, but the long stretch of highway wore me down faster than I expected. By the time I spotted a flickering neon sign for a roadside motel, exhaustion had settled deep in my bones. The motel was one of those old, half-abandoned places, the kind you only see when you have no other choice. The sign read vacancy in sputtering red light, the no dimmed to a faint outline. I hesitated but turned into the lot, too tired to keep going. The man at the front desk gave me a single key without a word, sliding it across the counter. He barely looked at me, his eyes sunken and glazed over, as if I was just another shadow passing through. I wanted to ask if there were other guests, but something about his blank expression told me I wouldn't get an answer. Room 6. The hallway leading to it was dim, lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. Every door I passed was closed, no sounds coming from inside. When I reached my room, I had to force the key into the lock, the metal grinding unpleasantly before the door gave way. The room smelled of mildew and stale air, with an old heater rattling weakly in the corner. The bed was rumpled, sheets pulled slightly off the mattress, as if someone had left in a hurry. But what struck me the most was the mirror, a full-length one facing the bed, reflecting every corner of the small room. It felt intrusive, too large for such a cramped space. I was too tired to care. I tossed my bag on the chair and collapsed onto the bed, the springs groaning beneath me. The room was too quiet, unnaturally so. I tried to shake off the unease creeping in, chalking it up to exhaustion and bad luck. I closed my eyes. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of movement. It was subtle, a barely there shuffle, like someone shifting their weight across the floor. I held my breath, every muscle locking up. The sound didn't come from outside. It came from inside the room. I cracked one eye open, scanning the shadows. Nothing moved, except for the reflection in the mirror. In the glass, I saw it, the door behind me slowly swinging shut. But when I turned around, the door was still open, exactly as I'd left it. My pulse quickened. I looked back at the mirror. The door in the reflection was fully closed now, and someone was standing behind it. Just a dark outline, too tall, too still. The air grew thick with dread. I stared, paralyzed, as the figure in the mirror began to move, stepping out from behind the door, inching closer to the bed. I whipped my head around, but the room behind me was empty. Only in the reflection did I see him, his gaunt face pale, eyes hollow, watching me with unsettling intent. He moved closer with each second, a slow, deliberate crawl toward the edge of the bed. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and backed toward the door. But the figure in the mirror stayed with me, closing the gap between us with every faltering step. I reached the door, yanked it open, and fled into the hallway. The sound of footsteps trailed me, echoing too close behind. I burst into the lobby, gasping for breath, only to find the front desk empty. No clerk, no signs of life. Just an old, flickering lamp casting shadows across the walls. I ran to my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. When the engine finally roared to life, I tore out of the lot without looking back. The next morning, I called the motel from the road. The number rang endlessly, never connecting. Later that day, I learned the place had been shut down years ago. Room 6 shouldn't have existed. But I was there, and something else was too. Don't forget to subscribe and watch more of my videos. Thank you.